front of the new CNA building, the CNA being the central authority authorizing adoptions that was brought into existence by Guatemala's efforts to accede to the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoption. Escobar had first spoken to the BBC in November 2007 when she and other mothers of kidnapped children, members of sobrevivientes, survivors, had demonstrated with their empty baby strollers, saying that their children had been stolen and sold into adoptions, in a conscious echo of the Madres de Plaza de Mayo. Further, while the adoption of Esther Sulamita was reviewed by the new system, it was then approved, including through the use of 2 apparently falsified DNA tests. Finally, the BBC tells us that it was not the review process, not officials at all, but the child's mother herself, that uncovered the kidnapping and the fraud. She saw her daughter with a U.S.-American couple and went to authorities and demanded a DNA test on the spot, which found that it was indeed her daughter. And while the story of Ana Escobar marked considerable but not surprising differences between the U.S.-American and the British press, by 2004, after the widespread ratification of the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoption by most European Union countries, few adoptions took place between Guatemala and the EU. The difference between this story and the one in the Guatemalan press is still more remarkable. Beginning in the mid-90s, the Guatemalan press ran stories, sometimes many times a week, of children disappeared, kidnapped, and adopted. Indeed, my file of clippings from the Guatemalan press of children allegedly kidnapped who sometimes found their way into international adoptions is 1.5 inches thick, more than 300 articles, and that's from 1993 to 2003. After that, the press is digitized, and any number of searches on, say, the Prensa Libre website with words like robo y adopciones, theft and adoption, turns up hundreds more articles. These articles narrate the evolution of criminal mafias that were seen as essentially coterminous with the state itself, in which judges, social workers, and those issuing passports were well aware of and profited from the organized crimes of violence and disappearances, and that these networks reached back into the Civil War. In this context, it makes little sense to differentiate between trafficking and legal adoptions, as we want to do. Carmela Carup of the Federal Attorney General's Office of Guatemala put it this way: everything about adoption procedures is legal. All, in inverted commas, is legal. The intimate connection between government forces and organized crime helps explain something, or the perception of it at any rate, helps explain something that's often hard for those from outside Guatemala to understand: the mob violence against those accused of child stealing, and any number of other crimes. But it's the mob attacks on the midwives and the jaladoras, the arrangers, that make the international press. Maybe because they're typically women, or maybe because the violence is sometimes targeted foreigners. Communities believe they can't rely on the police or the state for justice or for protection against criminal violence toward their children, and so they take matters into their own hands. In Guatemala, these criminal mafias had the strong support of the evangelical Christian right, a strange alliance with roots in the armed internal conflict in the country. Christian anti-communism and the relationship between Ronald Reagan and Efraín Ríos Montt. The links between the U.S. Christian right and the Cold War leadership of Guatemala in the early 1980s were explicit and well-known, giving rise to tremendous and well-founded cynicism when Ronald Reagan pronounced that Efraín Ríos Montt was getting a bum rap on his human rights record in Guatemala. Montt is an evangelical pastor in a denomination founded in California, the Church of the Word, and he was also the leader of the Guatemalan military junta in the early 1980s, which notoriously carried out a scorched earth policy in the indigenous highlands, one subsequently named as genocidal by the Truth Commission report. Guatemala's military and paramilitary groups, to a far greater extent than the better-known projects of Argentina and El Salvador, carried out a campaign to disappear children during the anti-communist Civil War. Many of these children were then adopted, including sometimes overseas. The human rights group Todos por el Reencuentro has found more than 200 children that were disappeared during the war and then adopted. Over and over again, we find in the reports of Todos, particularly in indigenous communities, but also among Latinos, that the paramilitary groups, the PACs, and the military actually ran a highly effective adoption bureaucracy, if we want to call it that. Every one of the hundreds of children that they disappeared and then placed in a family was placed in a family, with only occasional recourse to ancillary institutions like orphanages, or for older boys, military barracks. Hundreds, maybe thousands of Guatemalan families, particularly but not exclusively indigenous, adopted children in the 1980s and 90s and raised them as their own. For better and for worse, they taught them a new language, fed them, clothed them, educated them, and dressed the girls in the traje, or Latino dress, appropriate to their communities. Indeed, the stories from the Civil War also suggest that there's something implausible about one of the main arguments made for transnational adoption. That Guatemala has no culture of adoption and lacks the capacity to build a bureaucratic state apparatus to place children within the country. The disappearance and placement of children by the military and the PACs revealed the extent to which they ran a highly functioning bureaucracy, well-funded, multilingual, and with national reach. Children the military disappeared in order to terrorize their families and communities did not get dumped in the streets of Guatemala City. Guatemala has a culture and a history of state-sponsored adoption. It just doesn't have a history of civilian state-sponsored adoption. Or rather, the state has relied on churches, NGOs, and the massive private for-profit network of notaries and facilitators that offer their services when U.S. adoption agencies came calling. It's not the case that Guatemalans won't adopt. It's that the military stopped running its program. The civilian government has resisted creating anything resembling a welfare state-style system of child placement, and private adoption entities find that it is not nearly so profitable to arrange adoptions within Guatemala as outside of it. In the decades after the peace accords in 1997, Guatemala had the largest international adoption program per capita of any place in the world, peaking in 2007, when 1 in every 100 babies born in Guatemala was raised as an adopted U.S. American, an unprecedented transfer of children without parents from one place to another. In contrast to the tale told in the U.S. of adoption fraud that came to light after 2007, by 1994, the Guatemalan legislature had already debated 15 bills proposing adoption reform to combat fraud, although all had failed. But the effort built renewed energy after the 1996 elections in Guatemala, which brought the historical adversaries of the Civil War into the legislature together. Adoption reform was one of the main arenas in which they squared off. One of the chief proponents of transnational adoption was none other than Efrain Reyes-Montt. One of the major figures proposing adoption reform was Nineth Montenegro, best known as a human rights activist, and one of the founders of the group for mutual support, GAM for its initials in Spanish. Family members of those disappeared or otherwise victimized by state violence. After the disappearance of her husband in 1984, Montenegro had sat in at government buildings and demanded accountability from the police and the military for the disappearances, somehow surviving even as other members of GAM were being targeted as subversives and murdered themselves. One of the first issues the newly elected 1996 Congress struggled over was the enactment of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Evangelical groups opposed it, articulating a Guatemalan family values position that was much like the Christian right position in the United States. The family was the foundation of the church and of society, and women and children needed to be protected from the corrupting influence of the state and other secular institutions. Although the U.S. Christian right focused obsessively on legal abortion, which was not an issue in Guatemala where it was illegal, The Christian right in the U.S. had also elaborated positions on adoption in the